which, if you're interested, outlines what I term an 83-note non-EDO superscale. It's just my way of conceptualizing the tonal space I'm creating here. Since 38 and 48 have two common intervals, the octave and the tritone, it's not simply the sum of the numbers, it's because there's a commonality between them. But the outcomes of the previous piece, Guy Salid, for the Kingwood System Alto Flute, I treated multiphonics on there as sound objects. So I decided to, for the pre-compositional process for this piece, create sound objects that would utilize notes from both tuning systems. And that led to this, which is my sound object approach, as I called it at the time, for this piece. A sound object in the context of this piece consists of harmonically or vertically arranged notes, and they are paradigmatically related. And the notion of paradigmatic here refers to a distinct set of intervallic relations within a given tonal space. The objects, in turn, were sequentially ordered, and then transitional tones were constructed between the objects. So just to make it clear, the objects, can you see my map? Yeah, you can. Brilliant. The objects are these main kind of groups of notes here, represented by the bigger note heads. Transitional tones are the smaller note heads. And they were arranged with a number of factors, considering the relative harmonic richness of the objects, as well as implications for perceived tension and resolution. And these were constructed intuitively. But the note choice was made in reference to proximity to just intonation intervals, although just intonation is not a primary factor in my compositional language at the minute. But of course I make reference to it, with specific intervals being quite closely approximated. Those of you with a keen eye for detail may notice that there are some techniques implied in the sound objects here, such as glissandi, singing and playing, split tones, pedal tones. That was made with reference to the possibilities of the microtonal trumpet through the various resources that are available. And so bonus points, I guess, if you notice that. But whilst EDO is, or was, still is, was, EDO was my primary focus at this stage. I mentioned that specific just intonation intervals were considered, but in total for Oysen there were 6 sound objects, which represent the 6 main stages of the piece. Those 6 main stages are not necessarily meant to be perceived when listening to it. It's more of, it was a compositional way of ordering the piece. But the notated objects and transitional tones were synthesized using retuned synthesizers, which I actually played last year, so maybe I'll play it now, but using a kind of sparkly sound just because I could. It's going through here, but. Testament to how good these MacBook speakers are, because it's down here. It was really clear for me. So, I mean, you may ask, was this a good way of organising the pre-compositional process for the piece? And to that, I'd say, thank you for asking, yes. The concept of sound objects, as utilised here, facilitated the organisation of harmonic, which is vertical, polymicrotonal material with consideration for extension into melodic construction, thinking horizontally there, through the construction of a set of intervallic relations such as this, which are constrained to the realm of possibilities of the mediums through which it's to be realized, in this case the microtonal trumpet. The hypothesis was that polymicrotonal exploration and composition would be facilitated as any combination of pitches within a given object would produce a distinct and directable affective quality due to their inherent paradigmatic relation. So this approach demonstrates the utility and benefit for facilitating polymicrotonal, harmonic and melodic exploration by means of reducing the scope of the material available and through the organisation of small sound clusters of related intervallic relations, but then also showing consideration for the broader formal implications between the objects in composition. The process of synthesizing and actually being able to listen back to them highlighted the potential of the objects as spectral identities, once synthesized, the objects were perceived as a unity and did not necessarily promote identification of the harmonic relationships between the different tones of an object, nor necessarily the attempted description of tones to specific tuning systems. In essence, the synthesized sound objects became gestalts, with their materialistic novelty being capable of invoking distinctive affective qualities. And they also, the sound objects here, sort of nodded towards Smalley's spectromorphological approach in the way that they suggest developing structural relations over time. And that was sort of the main point that I took forward from this. I have an outcome slide, but I'm going to deviate.
Can I ask a question? You know the last slide. What are the accidentals?
So, I mean, it's hard to say because, well, so I use the standard sort of arrowed accidentals for 48 EDO. I also do that for 38. The blue notes I should have mentioned that. The blue notes are 38 EDO. So you can see there's actually less of them, which when we come to record it, we notice that the 48 EDO part on the C trumpet actually is a bit more complex. But, so, I mean, as I mentioned, the sort of the temporal development over time was the crucial factor that I wanted to explore further. And whilst overall this approach provided invaluable insight into the importance of consideration for temporality, time, in a pre-compositional approach, it provided a facilitative entry point into exploring a tonal space which I constructed through the combination of different tuning systems. So that is the titles of the piece, or they are the titles of the piece for what my portfolio will look like. I've not spoken about Grease Leerd because I spoke about that a lot. Oysern, I've just spoken about. Amsterdam, which is actually a title of a horror film, which I really like. And it's going to be played in Amsterdam, and amongst other things, that's the title. Actually, there was a unique approach for me because I never usually name a piece before I start it, whereas this time I did. Then the next piece is Phi, and then Equinox. I'll speak a bit about those last three now, but trying to trace the elements of the development from Oysern. That's what I'm going to try and speak about a bit more today. So, Amsterdam is a piece for Kingma system alto flute, Carrillo piano, and Fokker organ. So, the Carrillo piano and the Fokker organ are microtonally granular in that they are strictly adhering to 96 EDO and 31 EDO, respectively. So I decided, as a way of complementing that, I would introduce the Kingma system alto flute to this arrangement, which I then ended up writing in a sort of theoretical 48 EDO framework, which then actually moved to 96, and I should apologise to Carla for that, but it's matching the pitches of the piano. So that's why I've said that this piece, the tonal space for this piece would be 96 EDO and 31 EDO, because 24 and 48 are both subsets of 96. So, and also there was a nice link there because Eva Kingma is a Dutch flute maker. The instruments are in the Netherlands. I'm Dutch, so it's all kind of coming together. But building on Oysern, the pre-compositional approach for this piece would investigate the expanded integration of temporality into a polymicrotonal sound objects approach, which promoted the reevaluation of the term sound objects. So the notion of sound objects implies a static, vertically arranged framework with little consideration for temporality. The transitional tones demonstrated the importance of the temporal aspect in the pre-compositional approach and afforded significant compositional potential in the direction of melodic constructions. So the concept of sound objects would be renamed to sound fields at this piece, as to place a greater emphasis on the consideration for temporality, and to take the concept further to be representative of an affect-informed framework of paradigmatically related melodic constructions and structured moments of connections between them, those melodic constructions and also the tuning systems, as to expedite the navigation of the framework that I construct for the piece. So this is an example of a sound field. And in total for Amsterdam, there was 3 sound fields constructed functioning as a sound field set. Those of you who would have seen any of the microtone, Small is Beautiful in Salzburg, I think Richard might, but I spoke a bit more about this. And in the chapter that I wrote for that, I spoke even more about it. I'm not going to speak too much about it because what I found was that although the initial, I sort of started working with these, and you can see there's only the flute and the piano here. You can see the extended techniques that are there, the top, although the fingerings aren't on there, they're multiphonics. The crazy accidentals you have to use for 96 EDO, and things like that. But I started to briefly explore these sound fields in composition in the forms of sketches or short etudes. And what I found was that it promoted a sort of developmental familiarity with the tonal space that I'd created through the combination of tuning systems. And I started to explore the relationships between the tuning systems and also the instrumentation, thinking of them as timbral layers. But these initial compositional explorations highlighted, not only in my compositional style, a tendency to explore self-similar compositional ideas, but also developments constructed by reference to previous fragments of ideas from my own piece or from the etudes and sort of bring them around. And that could be traced in the trumpet piece Neusern as well, as we noticed. But it led to melodic and harmonic constructs for the Fokker organ being directly or directing further explorations within the sound field rather than being directed by the sound fields. So what I mean by that is I started to compose for the Fokker organ intuitively in response to the sound field sets and the pitches I would derive from that. And it would also promote pitch explorations for pitch relations beyond the sound field set. So it was no longer confining me to this. It would promote intuitive compositional development beyond this, thinking how I could take it further. So I decided to investigate this a little bit more and work towards a sort of hybridized, systematic, intuitive, affect-informed polymicrotonal approach. And by affect-informed, that's a term I use in my research a lot. I sort of would have to explain that best by quoting Stravinsky in that when asked for whom he composes for himself and the hypothetical other. I think about that a lot when I compose. I compose and I listen, but I try and listen from both an objective and subjective standpoint. I try to listen from not only the person who I'm composing it, but also try to listen to it as if I was listening to it without knowing the formalized relations that I'm exploring or the processes that I'm looking into. And it's because I have the benefit or the privilege of being able to listen back to my compositional ideas in real time, I can react to them and then intuitively draw or try to find out what I'm hearing in a response to what I'm working with. So these sound field sets provided that entry point into the tonal space I defined. But something I hadn't mentioned about Neusern is that it is completely devoid of time signatures. It is completely metrically free, which in theory, I mean, it's interesting, but it promotes or provides some difficulties perhaps in practicalities for performance, for recording, as we found. So I decided to start looking into ways I could systematize this metrically fluid way of composing that I like to have. And that led me to the idea of using polymetric constructions. I'm a big fan of metal music. I'm a big fan of a band called Meshuggah. If you know their music, you know that, generally speaking, they have a 4/4 sort of rhythmic stream that is consistently played throughout the piece of music, often highlighted in the snare and the cymbals. Snare often on beat 3. But the way that they structure their music, although they think they deny this actually, but it's obvious, is that they construct it through what are termed hypermetric boundaries. So you have 16 measures of 4/4, and the guitar riffs are moving in perhaps 21/16 time signature. They will truncate at 16 bars, whether they complete that full cycle of that idea or not. I've sort of elaborated and sort of taken that and made it my own, allowing myself a little bit more freedom with it. And I structured the piece Amsterdam's around that. I'm not really expecting you to need to internalize all of what's on the screen here, but it's just sort of to highlight that you can tell there's patterns here. I was moving in 12 measures of 4/4, and it's what I termed the 4/4 referential hypermetric approach. And that is that the organ, the Fokker organ, would always, for the most part, be in 4/4, and the flute and the piano would phase against that through different time signatures. For example, 6/8, 9/8, or 7/8, and 10/8. And then they would truncate at hypermetric boundaries, and it provided a way of me structuring the music and structuring these, or promoting these sort of complex polyphonic exchange between the different layers, and thinking of instruments as layers. It's hard for me to show a 40-something page score to you in a presentation, but there's an example here of the second section where, as you remember, I think it was 7/8 and 9, 6/8 and 9/8 at the beginning. The piano then truncates, resulting in about 6/8 before the next section starts again. The organ's still moving in 4/4. The piano then starts moving in 10/8 and flute in 7/8. Again, practicalities. It's yet to be performed. It's yet to be rehearsed. Also, for what it's worth, in Dorico, the time code score stave doesn't work anymore because Dorico, unfortunately, if the Dorico allows you to do polymetric notation, it still has its quirks because it's not exactly conventional. But exploring how this will be performed, it's supposed to be premiered in May next year, subject to it actually happening. But it should happen. But and it'll be exciting to see how that works. And I mean, at the minute, I'm not so much thinking about it, but I think what I'll do is individual part scores with a timecode stave on each one, and thinking about it like that. I know the organ can be controlled by MIDI, but it's not as cool. So the next piece, which built out of that, I'm going to move at a little bit of a brisk pace just to stay on time here, and I'm mainly focusing on the development of my pre-compositional approach. The next piece, Phi. Now this, since August last year, so I've been sort of a compositional residency with the Bled Contemporary Music Festival. And the way that works is that you either apply as a composer or a performer with your instrument. They assemble an ensemble that you then compose for if you're a composer. So this piece is for flute, bass clarinet, classical guitar, piano, and cello. None of which are inherently microtonal if you think about it in a certain way. It's not a Kingma flute, it's just a normal flute. So of course I asked the guitar player to retune their guitar to quarter tones and use all forms of multiphonics with microtonal pitches and pitch bending and such, and also utilizing the lower range on the cello because you have a bit more accuracy there, things like that. And this approach to this piece, I mean, it's constructed therefore in a theoretical 48 EDO framework. I do stress that performers aren't expected to achieve complete accuracy here, but this is what I started using the term polytemporal rather than polymetric, because I wanted to explore the idea of polytempo, which I then implemented through the use of what term aleatoric boxes, where, for example, these are two harmonics on the guitar, and then the idea is that the performer will speed up and slow down freely in response, intuitively as well. Actually, this piece will have a conductor, which is such a privilege because we only have 2 half-an-hour practice sessions or rehearsal sessions. So these ideas are going to be easier to communicate, and the performers are on board with it. But I mentioned earlier about the consideration for the performers and perhaps their level of experience with microtonal composition. All of these performers are aware of microtones and microtonal pitches, but perhaps don't have as much experience, and they're playing on instruments where microtonal pitches are still considered an extended technique, although extended techniques is a term I try to avoid a bit. They're just techniques. But this piece was an interesting one to compose because I started to develop that idea, moving away from the idea of having this sound field sets to this, which is the next slide shows the actual pitches for that. But this is what I term a micromorphological flux, big word. Building on the idea of spectromorphology that I mentioned earlier, the idea that you have developing structural relations in time. And in this piece, the field lines, the arrows, represent the instruments, and the planes, or the circles, represent a moment in time. Now, this is actually, this idea came to me when I was in Salzburg in the Mikroton conference, and it's sort of parallels the way that you draw magnetic fields in physics. The dotted lines between between the field lines represent points of convergence, thinking in terms of pitches there for this piece. And you can trace the way, and I sort of indicate, although it isn't actually there, but I sort of indicate the idea that the higher up the line, the higher in pitch in relative to the other ones. Although, of course, in composition, I don't strictly adhere to that. This same diagram can be represented here with the actual pitches, which, using the extended techniques of the instruments, I constructed the main pitches for the section. It moves in 3 sections. In a similar way, see how Oysern has the sections and the pitches for each section that I explore. Again, for example, the first here, harmonic on the cello moves to a multiphonic on the bass clarinet with a couple of multiphonics in the flute. The idea that it's slanted means that it develops over time, and you can sort of see that I've indicated that here. Again, arpeggiation here implies that arpeggiation is going to be a key technique in that section of that piece. I indicate dynamics, which thinking more dynamics as a broader formal construct, not a thinking over the main duration of a piece, or of the section of the piece rather. I've got a couple of minutes left, so I just want to talk about how I've then developed this idea, the micromorphological flux, into my next piece, which I finished not so long ago, Equinox. Now, I have not long come back from Montreal in Canada, where I did a 6-week residency there at the University of Montreal to compose a 8-channel fixed media piece. My first foray into multi-channel composition. And also, in terms of this PhD, my first piece, which is going to be, is electroacoustic, and it's going to be played through speakers, primarily. This picture is a picture I took in Montreal, and then I digitally affected it, obviously, because Montreal doesn't look like this, at least not when I was there anyway. So I just liked the picture, and I've kind of ended up using it as I relate the image to the music in my mind somehow. But this piece, the tonal space for this piece, uses various equal divisions of the octave, and also, get ready for this, an equal division of the tritave, which is completely different there for me. The tritave being, was it 1902 cents? It's an octave plus a perfect fifth. And equally dividing that into 17 notes, which provides an interval of 1230 cents. So the octave, which is 30 cents, slightly larger. Really cool, especially when you play that with the octave from, say, 96 EDO. Now, the tuning systems I use for this piece, because I have complete accuracy, because I'm in a digital environment, vary between 5 and 240 EDO, and then 17 EDT, equal division of the tritave. And they're organized around these points of convergence, or near points of convergence. Thinking in sort of Luigi Nono, all the pitches are C, even if they're 50 cents above or below, they were thinking they're C, for example. And again, and I use the idea of polytemporal approach using something called a metric tree, which I'll show you again in a minute. Just in the interest of time, that is what it developed to for this piece. The idea of Equinox is that because I have this multi-channel environment, it sort of emerges from the east, sets in the west. Just it gave me a bit of a formal idea, but the idea is that the sound that appears then breaks down and then develops back into the same sound that then sets in the idea that it could be played in a loop, hence the sort of, the bar lines. But I've not got time to explain all of this, but the idea that differs from the previous piece, Phi, is that the field lines represent tuning systems, and the circles or the planes represent timbral identities. So I can start to link different tuning systems with different timbres and structure that. And you'll see here that what is actually 96 splits into 96 and 192 EDO. And then that timbrally shifts, to use that term, to join what is then at that point in the piece 240 EDO. So it's hard to explain by just showing you the picture. But what I wanted to show really was the idea that developing from OISERN, this sound object approach, that developed into the sound field sets approach that I use in Amsterdam. Then I took a step back and started thinking, how can I be a bit more intuitive with this? And that led me to a sort of graphic notation in a sense that is a way of me visualizing my compositional approach. Also using a sort of John Cage-ian time bracket notation at the top to indicate how long a section might be. And then also here, utilizing the way that I can think in terms of spatial maps for the different, different ways that this, this is quite a rudimentary way of thinking because it fades out that way. But it's an interesting way of working, and I find it to be incredibly useful for me to visualize music in this sense because I'm not being so specific with the pictures. There are, I haven't done them yet, forgive me, for each individual flux diagram with the field and the field lines, there is specific notes for each section that I would be constructing around because I use the dotted lines between the field lines as indicating that there are points of convergence between tuner systems that I structure the music around, and it's in a way that it's definitely a way that makes composing intuitive for me. It's not necessarily important that this is perceived when listening to the music. And then just to finish off, the metric tree idea is that using the metric trees website, I think it works quite well, is the idea that I have 15 moving against 16. And again, almost everything in this piece is organized according to this. And that 15 is divided into 8 and 7, and the 8 and 7 are divided into 3, 3, 2, and then I structure events in the music that happen on these beats, and they phase against each other. Again, it's not necessarily important that you perceive that, but it's important for the formal construction of the piece. So that's a bit representative of where I've gone with everything. I'll be shortly summarising this a lot more articulately with a little bit more academic language, so to speak, and more sort of considerations for the broader sort of potentials of where I could apply this system. My plan is to apply it to guitar playing. I'm a guitar player. I've identified that there's definitely a place for microtonality in metal music for various reasons. I'll be talking a bit more about that in a presentation soon, but I'd like to start applying my ideas to different contexts and exploring that. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sure there's some questions, so thank you. Richard?
Yeah, so that was fascinating stuff. I mean, mind-boggling in a way. But I'm just wondering, if you could say a bit about your attitude towards accuracy, because the more you divide octaves up and fine-tune the tuning, the more the sort of inaccuracies that are inevitable with live instruments are going to sort of impact it and compromise these beautiful systems and distinctions between tuning systems. And I'm reminded of when I asked Steve why he calls it 19 divisions, 19 div rather than 19 EDOs, because he said because they're not equal, and
Yep.
it's because he can't play. I think Steve plays in tune, but anyway. Just what is in tune?
What is in tune? Great question.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I mentioned, and I make an emphasis on certain things, a theoretical 48 EDO framework. I'm structuring the music around these points of convergence between tuning systems, but I'm completely understanding of the fact that in practice, well, there's so many factors that influence how pitch will sound. It could be as small as the temperature of the room for certain instruments. I'm not so, I don't expect it to be so accurate to the point where I'm, cracking the whip to say, no, it's not 48, that was slightly off. It's, for me, I'm structuring the music around these points. It's an important aspect for me in terms of the formal approach, but I understand that in practicality, when actually performed, there might be slight differences. And I think that's okay. I also think that adds character to the piece. But when I work in a digital environment, I have complete accuracy, and that was quite, almost. Hence why I started dividing octave into 240 notes, because I could. That's also a sort of approximate, just notable difference as well, 5 cents. It varies, but I use 5 cents. So the upper limit is 240 for the just notable difference, so I thought, why not? But I sort of, when me and Steve have been recording the trumpet Oysern the past couple of days, and obviously 48 division and 38 division, if your instrument has the foundational capability to create, for example, I'll take the Kingma System Auto Flute, 24 EDO, it has quarter tone levers and the fingerings. I won't say easy, it promotes 24 EDO, quarter tones, as structural notes rather than just inflective, whereas if you extend beyond that to, say, eighth tones, because there's that difficulty in producing them, it might promote them to be more inflective rather than structural. I'm trying to go beyond that and structure music around these moments and points, and particularly in polymicrotonal environments where I seem to find myself in a lot for my own choice, but because I think it's interesting. I have looked before at the idea of using div rather than EDO, but EDO to me, the octave is such a fundamental aspect in a lot of what I do that my approach is I'm equally dividing the octave and then having multiple equal divisions of the octave and using that to structure my music. Of course, in this piece, I equally divided the tritone, but then I also had 53 EDO in this piece, which has a very close approximation of the fifth, which then meant an octave plus a fifth might be, well, it turns out it was almost the same as the tritave in an equal division of the tritave tuning system, and I structure things around that. I also structure things around the fact that the octave, so to speak, in the equal division of the tritave was 30 cents sharp, and I'd divide that 30 cent interval with 240 EDO. And in a digital environment, what I'm trying to say, in a digital environment, I have perfect accuracy and I can explore this with much finer and greater detail. But in a non-digital environment, I'm aware of the fact that it will change, and I think I quite like that as well. But it's an important thing for the structural approach to the piece.
Do you have any preference, or is it just like one, swings and roundabouts?
Well, this was a new experience for me doing it in a digital, multi-channel as well, which has sort of ruined stereo for me, because octaphonic is the new stereo, I think I remember seeing. I think it was Stockhausen that said that. But there's also that you get the different relationships of intervals happening across you rather than just in front of you. That it happens that you can get the dissonance that happens. I don't have a preference, but I think I'd like to be able to explore spatiality in acoustic performance without making it gimmicky. And also I think working towards a blend of it might be an interesting aspect, you know, being able to, and of course, I mean, the OISO will be played with one trumpet being played for a speaker. That's not quite what I mean, but the idea is that you can have instruments responding to the digital environment that's being played, but then also perhaps using recordings of the instruments, digitally affecting them, and having that, and then composing with both. I think I'm going to move towards a sort of combined approach, but I still love writing for instruments, and the collaborative process of refining that score and then getting it performed and then hearing how it might change in a performance rather than what you hear through Dorico and things like that. I find that incredibly rewarding as well. So no preference, but I think I'd like to do it all in a way. Yeah, thank you. Done?
Question. In terms of your sort of pre-compositional charting of your kind of formal outline, how much is entirely pre-compositional and how much is then influenced as you work? Like, I mean, I know it's probably, you know, bar by bar varies quite a bit, but do you find there comes a point where you've gone through whatever you've sort of preconceived as part of this chart, and then thought, oh, I prefer the sound of this, the sound of this, and then that in turn kind of changes the development of the flux that you have written?
Yep. So for the piece phi here, I should also mention that the time brackets I use above them, this piece added after, because I didn't know how long the music was going to be. For this piece, the start and the beginning, I wanted them to be the same length. The idea of equinox. So I had that. I didn't know how long the bits in the middle would be. But I had I had quite a structured idea actually. I had a vague idea how long it would be, but I had a structured idea of what I wanted to achieve in each section. It's not necessarily represented on here, but basically the idea is that this is all of the pitch content happening. What happens at the end, which you arrive at the end, that falls away. Then you start moving towards finer subdivision. Then at this point, it is pretty much only notes happening within a 30 cents range, apart from the 53 DO. And then I knew that was going to be going into sitting there in the studio, actually creating this piece of music. But as I learned from doing serial composition a lot during my masters, I always want to break the rules I set, and I allow myself to do that because I think when intuition, when that starts to take over, I think that is often some of the most exciting stuff that happens in music. And not letting myself go where I want the music to go or where I hear the music to go just because I'm adhering to a system is not how I want to do it. So I guess in a sense, this piece in particular, I spent about 2 weeks just planning the tuning systems, planning what I was going to use, planning the points of convergence I was going to explore between those tuning systems, how I was going to evolve that from the beginning to the end. And I think I had to do that for this piece because I had complete choice of any sort of pitch content I want to do. Whereas when I'm writing for instruments, there is limitations you have to consider. And those limitations inspire creative use of those instruments. So something that might be interesting for me to look at or explore is the idea that maybe in a digital environment, you need to structure it more. Whereas with instruments, you can still structure it, but you have to consider for the practicalities and such like that. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah, thank you.
I had a question. Thank you very much for all of this. I had a question related to your talking about sound objects.
Mm-hmm.
I guess there's two things I wanted to ask. The first is that the idea of a sound object is quite like the idea of a found object, something that you happen across.
Yep.
And you can't influence, you work with it, like a sculptor finding a beautifully shaped pebble on the beach.
Yep.
It inspires them, they work with it. so choice is a bit beyond you.
Yep.
And I was interested about that aspect in the slide where you showed the spectra of the Kimber system flute and also Carrillo piano fields, which, that's right. So I imagine here you've chosen, or you'd happened across a collection of pictures for your Carrillo piano. Somehow you've chosen those, but the flute was giving you a spectrum a bit more like a found object. So it struck me that in that side there's this tension between what is given to you and beyond your control and what you are choosing yourself. So I found that interesting. Can I just do the other question? And then
Of course.
My other question is to do with this, something you said about the sound object being, I think you said the sound object being inherently non-temporal, sort of outside of time.
Yep.
And that, I couldn't help thinking, well, wait a minute, digital composers time stretch sound objects, and then they reveal the spectral evolution over time. And of course, you can then, you can reverse a time stretched sound object. And of course, nobody dictates how short or long a sound object is really by definition.
Mm.
So again, that's something I just wanted to gently challenge you about.
Okay, so I will say this, I arrived at the term sound object independently. As in, I termed what I was doing sound object, and then I sort of started to think about the implications of the term sound object in acoustic music, etc. And whilst that was not the main reason why I shifted away from that term, it was definitely a benefit moving away from the term sound object to sound fields, and then further because it removes that potential for confusion with acoustic music and the way that sound objects are used in that style of music. But the first question was how I arrived at the pictures for the piano here. So that's right that treating the to use the term that I did at the time, treating the multiphonics as sound objects. They are given to me. The pictures within that I don't decide the pictures of a multiphonic. That's what they are. I chose the multiphonics based on, I guess, their affective potential when listening to it, and then arranged them intuitively. The piano, Carrillo piano, was in one way it was done was the notes for that were arranged in response to those multiphonics, structuring moments together, perhaps structuring common pitches. Of course, as we mentioned, that the multiphonics, the pitches might not be precise, but I'm structuring it around these theoretical moments of convergence between them. But then also I started to think here in sort of organising in terms of not just pitch, but also in terms of timbral moments of connection, and then also heavily considering things such as tension and resolution, because I'm not thinking in terms of tonal cadences or anything here. I'm thinking more in terms of these often. I highlighted quite early on a tendency for me to rise and fall when I construct melodic lines, because falling, releasing that tension, things like that. And actually, in a couple of cases here, I tried to do the exact opposite, that break my own tendencies and things like that. But I think I definitely started with the flute. Although there was one sound field set where I think I started with the piano, and I think I chose an interval on the piano, the 16th tone or the 8th tone or something, and intuitively created this idea of I guess you could say it sort of resembles the idea of a row from serial thinking. Obviously not strict to those rules, but And this is where this is what made me realise I really wanted to explore this idea of this hybridised, systematic, intuitive approach. I think intuition is such an important part of it, and it's looking for ways that I can systematically be intuitive, which is a funny way of saying it, but or looking for systematic methods that promote me to be intuitive in music. Has that answered everything you were interested in? Okay, brilliant. Brilliant, thank you.
Just wanted to welcome any newcomers again. This is the first of two conferences that we're going to be having this weekend. Tomorrow we will be in the same room at the same time. We're going to take a quick break while I bring up my slides, and there's going to be a QR code for those at home. If you're interested in donating to the performers of the live music that we're going to have tomorrow night, I'd really encourage you to do so. But we'll be back shortly. Just a second. Okay. So we have one more presentation. I'm standing in for Philip Singleton today. He wasn't able to attend for personal reasons, but should be back next year. My name is Joseph Guzmano. Most of you in here know who I am, but for those of you at home, I am a PhD student here at Goldsmiths in my final year. and I'm one of the organizers of the festival, where Eddie was focusing on a 96-note division of the octave, and beyond with the 8-channel. I have found one of the central kind of goals of my research is to integrate increasing divisions of the octave. I used tone equal temperament to describe my music. Again, there are slight distinctions between that and EDO depending on how you define your octave. But I wanted to try, because I come from a fairly conventional, I played a lot of classical and late romantic music during my undergraduate, and my hope was to try to sort of slowly coax more and more musicians into the dark side of microtonality or hyperchromatic music. So I came up with a few different experiments for new types of notation, because one of the things I was dissatisfied with some types of microtonal notation is that it doesn't show often direct mathematical relationships between intervals. Oftentimes you have to use enharmonic spellings. That's a really popular way. Again, that's a very clear and direct way of integrating immediately into standard music notation. But I was sort of thinking as a string player, as a trombonist, if I were to think of the proportions of the tones, like how could I weigh them out and notate for systems where you, in this case, I wanted to use polytemperamental systems. So I have a piece of music. This is the final piece of orchestral music that I'm going to present today that I've written for my degree. It uses 12-note, 24-note, 18-note, and 36-note divisions of the octave simultaneously. Before I got into composing, I developed this sort of pie chart notation. So if you see, as I fill in the different slices of the pie to the clockwise, you raise the pitch by 1/12 of a tone, or roughly 16.67 cents. And then if we scroll down, starting here, this would be lowering a given pitch by 1/12 of a tone. So again, this would be lowering a pitch by 1/4 of a tone, or 3/12, right? This would be lowering by 1/3 of a tone. And so you can cover, I say I'm writing in a 72-note division of the octave, but most of the scale constructions I have are using a 36-note. So the 72-note division is sort of the underlying superstructure for all of these scales, but isn't necessarily used to develop out the music. I have not bit the bullet and bought Dorico myself, so I'm still composing this music on Sibelius, which presents some interesting issues, at least on the version that I have. You can get an automatic quarter tone playback. You can use the Vishnegradsky accidentals, and it will automatically assign kind of MIDI bends to pitches within a 24-note system of the octave. They assign the bass value 64 to any note in 12-note equal temperament. So any note that is listed as natural, sharp, or flat is assigned the number 64. But you can change that number, and if you take proportions of that number, you can change the MIDI pitch bend by that proportion. So roughly 1/12 of 64, with some rounding, because we don't want to get too ridiculous, is about 5.33. So if I want to raise, say, C natural up 1/12 of a tone, I would notate the pitch in Sibelius. I'd put the little quarter tone playback automatically. I get the value, and then you can change the number manually. So it's a very, very tedious process at first, but once you've input each kind of bass interval that you need for a given piece, copy and paste is a really helpful tool to kind of speed things up compositionally. So again, I've created a chart for this. Once you get past a semitone, or 6/12, I include in the piece of music the accidental. So if the note that I've given you is larger than a semitone, you will get the sharp plus the little pie chart notation to remind you that that is sort of where you're orienting around, yeah? So again, interestingly enough, even though as we get past that, so let's say we're going 7/12 of a tone, yeah? I still only raise 64 by 5.33 because, again, F sharp, for example, would be listed as 64 in the sort of MIDI language that's used by Sibelius, and then I'm just raising a semitone by 1/12 of a tone, so to speak. So on the one hand, it was helpful for the playback, but I think also for especially for the instruments that I use this notation in my piece, which are the strings and the trombones. It actually has a direct corollary to the practical implications of where to kind of place that pitch. So yeah, you can also import these images as accidentals. It is annoying, but if you save it as a template, then you can do this sort of indefinitely. It does provide some practical issues, so particularly if you're writing keyboard music, say, using this notation, you now taking up the space of where your dynamics would normally be written, you have a bunch of pie charts to deal with. There are a couple of practical ways of where you can place them. I'll go into that when I look at the scale constructions of this piece. But yeah, it's been a helpful system for me. I've thrown it at a few violinist friends, and they seem excited by it. So I did give it to a trombonist who preferred just the cent deviation from the pitch, which I think is perfectly acceptable. And again, if you can do the quick maths in your head, those do actually show the proportional relationship of all the pitches just as well. But this gives, I think, a nice visual if you're reading it on the fly. If you've ever eaten pizza before and had to serve 12 or more people, you can kind of figure out how to feed a quarter of the town, as it were. I'm going to, this is going to sound a lot like a non sequitur, but the final piece that I'm writing has to do with night terrors that I experienced as a child. So I had enormous tonsils growing up. Not to overshare at the Hyperchromatic Music Festival, but one of the consequences of this is I basically developed a form of sleep apnea at a very young age. And it's something that just kind of went unnoticed for a long time because it wasn't terribly extreme. But it means I didn't really get a good night's sleep for the first 5 years of my life. I'm sure that has had no effect on my development as an artist or a creative. But one of the things that happens if you sleep deprive yourself kind of incrementally over that amount of time is you don't get full REM sleep, and so you very often will wake up in the middle of your REM cycle, and you can experience fairly intense auditory and visual hallucinations, which were not terribly fun, but all of these hallucinations, most of which sounded like a bunch of car horns that were out of tune with one another, kind of happening all at once, which was unpleasant at the time, but interesting to reflect on later in life. There was always a dream that preceded these sorts of terrors, and it involved a very, very small yellow buttercup, which got infinitesimally smaller as the dream went on, being almost crushed by a very large tire. Again, I told nobody about this for years and years and years. It was just something that every time I would have that nightmare, I would wake up just screaming and hearing things, yeah? So I'm driving in the car with my mother a few years ago, and I was running back this dream. So you remember when you used to just wake up in the middle of the night? As a parent, that's a pretty terrifying thing to experience. And we were going through it, and I said, yeah, I always had this dream, and I talked about the flower and the tire, and she went white, and she thought I had the exact same nightmare as a child, which I thought was just really, really fascinating and kind of a rhetorically potent, the idea that the almost but not quite death of organic material at the hand of petroleum products seemed like an interesting premonition to have at an early age and to share across somewhat in a similar. So I'm not terribly spiritually minded, but I thought at the end of my undergraduate, I wrote a wind piece for my father, so my mother gets a turn with this orchestral piece that I've written. So, just like Eddie, you have a lot of tuning systems that you have to worry about. In many cases, I'm kind of shooting from the hip in some of these systems. It's the first time I've worked in a handful of them. So I needed to come up with my own game, right? I had to have some sort of pre-compositional notions before I went in. I remember I was talking to Lore a few months ago, and I said, composing in these systems kind of feels like I'm about to go for a run, and to tie my shoe, I'm just tying the most intense, convoluted knot before I can get up and go run around. So this was the first knot that I tied. I've been interested in using, again, treating 12-note equal temperament as just another palette of colors to use. So it's microtonal music that does use music that you would find in any kind of conventional classical or romantic or modernist setting. I started with a modified overtone scale. So there's this A scale construction that is sort of the 12-note tet's closest approximation of up to the 11th harmonic in the overtone series. So you get an F sharp, which in reality is actually a bit higher than that, and you get a B flat, which in reality is also a bit lower than that. I then took that scale and to sort of brush off the path behind me, I just added notes to it. So instead of an 8-note scale, or instead of a 7-note scale, I have an octatonic scale. I've added a handful of semitones to kind of create a bit more dissonance. But I basically gave myself a pattern. So I have a tone, 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 semitone, semitone, tone, semitone, semitone. That divides at the octave, even though it is an octatonic scale. And then I took that scale and I treated the tones and semitones as sort of large and small intervals. So when I went into a quarter tonal system, my semitone became a quarter tone and my tone became a semitone. So you end up with a scale that is twice as long. So these two rows make up, it's the exact same process then repeated twice, because if you've miniaturized the intervallic space, instead of spanning a full octave, you get a tritone, and then from that tritone you can get up to the actual octave. I do the same thing in this first row here, is using an 18-note division of the octave, or tone equal temperament. So third tones, right? So I have 2/3 of a tone is my large interval, 1/3 of a tone would be my small, and then if you transform that scale into sixth tones, or 36-note tet, you get a scale that looks like this. When I went to go compose, because I wanted to relate the material both melodically and harmonically through this kind of shrinking and enlarging process, I actually don't use, so in 36-note, I don't use any of these tones here. If I want to make a second movement for the piece, perhaps I will. Same thing for the quarter tones, right? I'm largely just using pitches from this scale, so I'm just assigning for 12-note equal temperament, I'm just assigning scale degrees and then just transposing those scale degrees. So that's what I did before I composed. Then I went, quick note about the annotation, anything that's in 18 or 36, so third and sixth tones, I've identified with kind of a red box. Anything that is in 24 or 12 is in blue boxes. Then there's some purple ones kind of showing specific motifs that are supposed to express elements of the dream, the tire and the buttercup, as it were. Yeah. So I composed this little chorale. Again, you can see the notation in practice. Right, so all of these instruments are using the scale that I've constructed, transformed into an 18-note division of the octave. So you can see right here in the cello, this is an F sharp that is 1/6 of a tone higher than the semitone, right? Or 2/3 of a tone, right? I use relatively simple rhythmic languages. There is a little bit of polyrhythm going on later on, but it's not terribly complex. This was a tension I had with my advisors. It's something that's come up in Vivas when I went into the upgrade for the PhD, is sort of, I've come up with these really, really radical, relatively all-encompassing tonal systems where the rhythms are fairly conventional. And my excuse, I suppose, is that I really wanted to get the listener to focus on the beating patterns that are produced by this fairly varied tonal system. And I thought if I went too complex with the rhythmical or the rhythmic patterns, I might lose some of that. It might obfuscate us, some of the more subtle changes in harmony, especially when we're dealing with 6th and 12th tones. That's not to say the next piece won't be really, really wacky. So that is how I got there. Then as I composed, so I got eight measures. Yeah. We copy and paste those 8 measures now into the upper strings. We invert some melodies. We develop out. The melodic material is put in counterpoint. So the woodwinds play in 12-note tet. My mother's a flautist, so I thought this would be a good instrument to start with. And trumpet is my first instrument. So she begins. There's something called a back tracing song. That's a type of folk song or rhyme. So like for parents trying to get their children to sleep, they will trace their back and say a rhyme. And so the rhythmic structure of the rhyme itself, X marks the spot with a dot, 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 line, 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 and a question mark. Jills going up, jills going down, jills going all around. That's the full kind of bit of text that I'm using. That determined the rhythm. The ordering of the pitches, I just, that was more intuitive, but I'm using the scale that I've constructed in 12-note equal temperament. And then this is the quarter tonal accidentals, which, again, you can use a specialized instrument for this, but Stephen, through microtonal projects, and actually we presented about this last year at the festival, you can use alternate fingerings on the trumpet to get just about every note in 24-note tempered equal temperament. So the brass, the trumpets, the horns work in quarter tones, and then the trombones and the strings work in third and sixth tones. So again, I'm dividing the forces by their temperaments. It's sort of an impressionist idea where you get a slightly neater orchestration. I mean, I'm less of a minimalist, more of a maximalist composer, but I do want to try to make distinct textures, and I thought if I could assign temperaments to each section with a handful of instruments in each one of those sections as sort of transitionary instruments. So, for example, the bassoons, if we go back to the scale constructions, the trumpets and the horns playing quarter tones, and then the bassoon and contrabassoon also playing quarter tones, right? So there's a way to, and I think the bassoon and the French horn and certain aspects of the cello have really, really nice, in certain parts of the middle range, or thinking of the orchestration of them, there's a lot of overtones in common, we'll say, yeah. So I made it as a way to both distinguish each member of the ensemble, but also find ways to relate them across the ensemble. So yeah, this is generally how it went. So we get, again, 2 8-bar phrases. The third 8-bar phrase, the counterpoint gets more complicated, so now we have 2 woodwind instruments that, the stretto increases, and they're just transposed at the octave. Now the bassoon and the trumpet are playing using a quarter-tonal scale in counterpoint with one another, and the strings and trombones are playing in third and sixth tones simultaneously. So it gets, again, more polytemperamental as the piece develops. From here on, this represents the dream and the night terrors to follow. Yeah, so here we have our rubber tire motif. So we've got a very low rumbling kind of sound in the cello, the bass, and the bass drum, and then we've got a piccolo at the very top of its range. I'm interested in kind of free atonal works, sort of the 5 pieces for orchestra comes to mind. And these are the early parts of the sort of moving away from kind of tonally centered music, right? Having a particular pitch as a tonal center, we'll say. This music does not do that, though. There are 3 tonal centers, all of which are a perfect fifth away from each other. There is F, there is C, and there is G. Yeah? So not only do I have different temperaments, but tonal centers are assigned to each one of those temperaments to kind of, again, make them cohere internally, but because they are all perfect fifth away from one another, they also are related in their overtone series. So I'm more interested in equal temperament than I am in the sort of acoustician's approach to microtonality. For now, there's so many of you that are really interested in just intonation, and it feels very, very tempting to start diving into it. So these motifs come back later on through the piece. From here on out, the structure becomes a little bit less symmetrical. So every rehearsal letter that's given represents a change in section. So the first bar of that is 8 bars, and then it becomes a 7-bar section, and then a 6, and then a 5, and then a 4, and then a 3. Every subsequent section gets shorter and shorter as you kind of jump in and out of consciousness. Yeah. So it's programmatic music, but it's written in a way where I've done a lot of systematizing of the pitches. Yeah. And then I'm just going to highlight a particular area of the piece where all of the harmonies kind of sound at once. Here, right here. So in bar 53 here at rehearsal H, that initial chorale that I've written, I go back in and use that. So it's not really pre-compositional, it's not post, it's intra-compositional process, right? So I've written out this chorale and the strings at the beginning, and then I use the vertical harmonies from that and just transform them outward into 18 and 12 and kind of into smaller intervals in 24 and 36. Then I have the first 2 chords of this progression sounding simultaneously across the entirety of the ensemble. So you're having all of the temperaments happening at once. Up until this point, it's fairly contrapuntal. There's not a whole lot of homophony that goes on, and obviously we've got tremolo in the strings, we've got fortissimos. This is going to be, I'm trying to hurt somebody in their headphones with, so to speak. And then that same harmony returns at the very end of the piece. Again, the final section, you get these motifs coming back with the chorale and the full melody that I'd written out originally. And then the cadence is, again, a similar kind of chord, a more sparse orchestration, and the dynamic level has changed. So it sort of puts those harmonies in different contexts with one another. I'm going to take a little bit of time now. I didn't want to use my own pieces in the listening session tonight, but I'll give you a taste of what the listening session might be like. So I'm going to play this piece for you. It's just a MIDI rendering of it, but it's using this playback strategy that I had. So these are fairly close to accurate in terms of all of these different divisions of the octave. Yeah. Let's come back to the beginning here. Give it a listen. It is quite quiet at the beginning, so I'm going to pop the volume up. Any questions?
So what's your rehearsal strategy? How are you going to get all these instruments to get as close to the pitches as you want?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because when you're dealing with 12th tones, I mean, this is where, I mean, changes in temperature will affect this. I think a fair amount of retuning is going to be in order. One strategy I've found, I mean, so last year I performed, it was just a quarter tone piece, so I mean, much easier than anything going on here, right? But I have some training as a vocalist, but I'm not a classical vocalist. That's not my primary instrument. And so initially I had written this duet for Laurie on the quarter tone accordion and for tenor to be performed by somebody else, and they dropped out, and then I had hired somebody else and they dropped out. And all of a sudden it was, 2 months to the performance, and I thought, okay, if I'm going to write this, I can sing. And one of the kind of interests, again, I'm trying to coax people that would otherwise be intimidated by or not understand microtones into doing this. I thought, well, I'll make myself the perfect kind of strategist. And so one of the things, I mean, working with a fully chromatic tuner, there's actually a free, this is not sponsored content, but there's a free app called Pano Tuner that will show you up to 1/8 of a tone pretty reliably. And so working with both the MIDI rendering of the piece and with a tuner, obviously that's going to play a pretty significant role in getting people to learn the music. The other thing, I've developed a resource that I shared a little bit last year, where this will be particularly helpful for string instrumentalists, although within a given partial you can use it to calculate distance on the trombone. Using the scale length of your instrument, I've developed an Excel spreadsheet that will automatically calculate 72 notes on your instrument, 2 octaves worth on any kind of plucked or bowed string instrument. So the hope is the combination of working with a tuner, having a fairly reliable MIDI playback for the individual parts, and then giving them, kind of going back to your basics as an instrumentalist and taking out your pencil or your rubber band on the trombone and kind of marking out where this is. I mean, on the one hand, everyone here, a lot of people here are specialized instrumentalists, where all of this can be performed on instruments that you can just find in most orchestras. You don't need to, you can create instruments, and there are instruments that will give you more reliable pitch, your pitch and your intonation will be much more reliable. But I'm struck by something Eddie said, where this is sort of a structural framework. I don't think I would be, if somebody is, a 16th of a tone off or the 12th tone isn't perfect, I think as long as within a given section, everybody is aiming for the same pitch, or within that subset of pitches, I'll be very happy, because it's, to me, I'm less worried about them being acoustically pure intervals and being intervals that we can differentiate from one another, so that you get this kind of a wider tonal palette, and you get these kind of interesting beating patterns. So I'm not, there's no sort of aleatoric techniques in my music, but I think even in 12-note tet, we're tuning our notes above and below as a result of that being a kind of imperfect tuning system to a certain extent in terms of the way that we shave our fifths. But yeah, this is why I didn't want to make the rhythms too complicated too, because I know in rehearsal this is going to be sort of a nightmare to make sure all of these chords sound in tune. But like the final chord that we get here, and the one that you get at bar 53, those would be things that I would tune section by section, and then kind of 2 sections at a time, and then across the total of it. So that people start to recognize the resulting texture that you get, right? You run into this very interesting thing when you start to study microtonal music, in that at a certain point, these beating patterns become less like permanent harmonic objects and vertical relationships, and it starts to actually, it sounds like, an emphasized vibrato. It starts to sound more inflective than the pitch itself. I hope that answers. We'll see. I do need to get this in front of an ensemble soon. So, yes, Richard, do you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. I was curious because I don't know if I'm right, but I got the impression that a lot of the finest tunings, the 3rd tones, the 6th tones, and so on, were in the bass.
Yes.
Kind of disrupt. I don't know if that's the nightmare thing, because it kind of disrupts the space spectrum, so if everyone else higher up is playing conventional tuning, the bass is offset, then it's going to feel kind of unsettling and
Yes.
more dissonant.
Precisely. Yeah. Well, and it's twofold. On the one hand, it absolutely has that effect. So the second time I get the trumpet melody, the very beginning. So the third group of 8 bars, where you get the entirety of the sort of backtracing motif. The trumpet and the bass are playing the same scale degrees, but the trumpet's playing quarter tones, and the bass is playing in the sixth and third tones. So, and it really does pronounce itself a bit more, and also just practically speaking, finding those pitches will be much easier on a larger scale length instrument. So it's, but yeah, that was kind of the idea, is that this was even when you come back to familiar, at least from the beginning of the piece, familiar territory at the end here, all of those melodies are being played, rather than in counterpoint with one another, they're being played homophonically in all of these different temperaments. So, yeah, absolutely. No, that's...
It's kind of anti-spectral.
Yes!
Or anti-spectral or something.
Yeah, there are some, I make a couple of, implicit in the structure, a couple of kind of tongue-in-cheek references to spectral composition, right? I use this sort of harmonic scale, right, this overtone scale that even in of itself is not actually an accurate representation of those overtones, because it's the semitone rounding, but then I'm also adding notes into it. I talk about the rhetorical significance about the tire and the flower, right? I always say nearly crushing the flower, because every time I would have the dream, it never actually did, so it was the anxiety of it rather than the actual destruction of whatever the flower represents to you. Yeah? And so one of the tongue-in-cheek jokes I make is the buttercup motif does not come back in the piccolo, but if I'm playing a G in this range of the flute, the G that I played on the piccolo earlier, as a consequence of the overtone series of this pitch here, is still sounding if you only have ears to hear it. So I'm being kind of cute in referencing that. But it's, in my PhD, I identify kind of 3, what I call sort of strains of thinking within microtonality. Because, right, Eddie mentioned this earlier, that the, microtonality is more of like a lens through which you can view composition. It's not necessarily a style or a genre or a particular instrumentation. So I try to look at the veins that I identify are sort of the acousticians, right? So this is everyone from your Pythagorean and just intonation kind of tuning systems alongside spectral composers, right? People that are interested in the sound object, right? The spectrum that is produced by a given pitch. What is interesting is that you can use equal temperament to measure a lot of these intervals, even if there are unequal divisions of a particular octave or a trident or things like that. There is, at some point, there is a small enough division of the octave where you can describe these intervals. And so there's this convergence with another vein that I've described as sort of the equal temperament camp. Yeah, so this is where I sort of place myself, right? I see these as just, it's a new palette to work with, right? It's not about necessarily making acoustically pure relationships between the pitches. It's in many ways making particularly impure sorts of, there's a lot of beating that goes on when I put some of these pitches together. And then the third camp that I identify are sort of the avant-garde, right? So if you think of like graphic notation or people that are using extra musical processes, think like chance music, and I mean Cage falls into this, right? Where you are getting microtones, and in some cases those microtones are part of the pre-compositional process, but it's not the central aspect of that pre-compositional process. It's something that results from, I think, from the Penderecki's, the Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima. You are going to get microtones from that graphic score, right? You're absolutely sliding between pitches in 12-note equal temperament, but he's not specifically notating those microtones. So this is, my interests, I think, in terms of research lie more with the acoustic and equal temperament kind of interest. I find I've got all sorts of weird radical beliefs about free will, so I kind of feel like I'm already in the game, so I don't need to construct another kind of pre-compositional process outside of the synthetic scales that I'm looking for. So, yeah. Absolutely.
How stubborn do you intend to be about accuracy, tuning accuracy?
I'm going to be awful. No. I think within a section, I would want to be fairly stubborn. I wouldn't want to have too much variance within a particular section. And I've tried to for the instruments like the trombone and really the bass that get kind of the most complicated, the most plentiful sort of tonal systems. I try to have them move a bit slower. I try not to give them really, really intense, fast, kind of polyrhythmic figurations, just because I do want the pitches to be fairly accurate, but the early experiments by Julian Carrillo, he sort of chose 96 as his division of the octave because he found most people, if you take a straight razor to a violin and you really test people where they stop hearing differences in pitch, he identified about a 16th of a tone. And I work for a music charity, and I do some peripatetic teaching in both group settings and in private lessons. And I teach guitar as one of the instruments. And you'd be amazed at how many kids, like an eighth of a tone will really jump out at them as being out of tune. Whether they can identify it as an eighth of a tone, like it does, there is something, once you start to live in it and you sit there with a tuner, you really can start to hear these intervals. I teach ukulele, and I have to tune 30 ukuleles before these kids show up. And I've been testing myself, right? How off is this from the kind of, G, C, E, A that I have to look for here? And, early on I was getting about 50% of them right, but if you really sit and do it, I'm getting up to 70% right. Yeah, so it's something that I think it's aspirational. I mean, this is outside of just the immediate interests in the degree itself. I think very often about the kind of social role of music, right? You have folk music that's used to celebrate and used to kind of ritualize things, and it's a way to organize society and celebrate with one another. You have kind of music for its own sake, which maybe is a bourgeois distraction, who knows? But I do think there's something pro-social about getting a large group of people together to try to do something very difficult. It just seems like it's the sort of collective suffering of trying to explore a 36-note tone equal temperament. That I think there's, what are you doing outside of that could be very unproductive, but I don't know. I'm optimistic, I think, and I've given this piece to a few, specialists, but I found there's a man named Jacob Elkin who you'll actually hear performance of his tonight at the listening session. He's a trombonist who can reliably play 12th tones. So for him, it was not even a question of, can I do this? It's just like, can you just notate it a particular way? So, I don't know how standardized my pie chart notation will be. If anything, it could be used as a fun teaching tool. I'd like to try to get more performers to take a look and try it out and just see how it feels for them. But in terms of the pitches themselves, I think there are people out there that are pretty reliably producing these tones. So, yeah. Any other quick questions?
Quick one. You mentioned you're talking about the idea that the eighth tone strikes out as the really, really dissonance, or the one that sounds out of tune. And I found that myself doing a lot of work in sitter. I actually then used the 16th tone as a sort of resolution to the eighth.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it got me thinking about, your piece is fantastic, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
And it got me thinking about how, maybe if you could just say a bit about how you consider tension and resolution when you're writing this, because you have these quite defined cells of material that then move against each other, and it's nice to see some polymicrotonal stuff or polytemperament.
Yeah.
If you could just maybe say a bit how if you're thinking about tension and resolution rather than any kind of tonal relationships between.
Yeah, during my master's, I got a kick out of reading. My professor recommended the Vincent Persichetti 20th Century Harmony, right? And one of the really interesting, there's a chart of intervals that he lays out early on where he talks about, okay, if we're not thinking of tension and release in purely triadic terms, we can really start to think of beating patterns, right? So in many cases, certain types of thirds anyway will produce actually quite a bit of beating where like open fourths and perfect fifths and octaves tend to be more resolved. On the one hand, I have some of that. So I try to look at tension in terms of orchestration also. So if you have lots of people doing lots of things, you're going to get more beating. Where if you have a sparser orchestration that kind of focuses on more of these open intervals. I also, not to say that I can talk about tonic and dominant relationships, but if you go back to the scale constructions, if I go here, there is an augmented triad, spelled in harmonically here, right? If we have G, B, and D sharp, or if I look at the third tone, because really I start in the strings with the third tones, right? We have an F at roughly the halfway point, not quite. We have an A, and then it finishes at that C sharp. This is another interesting result when I transpose the scale using third tones, because it's constructed in a semitonal way. I'm no longer dividing an octave. I didn't make note of this before. I'm dividing a major sixth spelled as an augmented fifth here. So there are, especially in the strings, the kind of cadences. So in the same way where you were sort of thinking in your pieces about, all right, here are some kind of fixed guideposts that I can arrive at and depart from. It's actually just an augmented triad for the most part. Like if you, the opening of the piece is just an augmented triad on F in the strings, and it closes on the exact same triad in the same voicing. So yeah, so there, again, a lot of my writing is relatively conventional when compared to other, I think, microtonal composers. I think, which you could see as a limit or as sort of an access point for people that wouldn't otherwise be as immersed in this. So yeah, but that is, I definitely, it's a weird kind of frame of mind that you have to shift into when you no longer have your sort of safe cadential patterns, and it's that balance of intuition and structure, right? And where you draw that line. I feel this piece for me is the most comfortable I felt in terms of that balance. I felt like there was still a fair amount of this that was through composed, and I felt the orchestration got to be a little bit more creative. Some of the pieces I wrote at the earlier part of this degree were much more, there's more pre-compositional stuff going on in terms of dynamics, in terms of texture, in terms of technique and things like that. So yeah. I think for now we will break for lunch. There are lots of options for food around here, and then we'll try to come back in roughly 30 minutes. Just as everybody comes back in, we'll start up and we have one more presentation to go. Thank you all so much again for coming in. I appreciate it. And again, for everybody watching from the live stream, either now or later on, the donation QR code is popping up again, so if you feel so inclined, go for it. Nice.
that will
Turn the audio.
that will
start the stream.
Oh, okay. So the stream is. Are there people like watching in real time? Can they see me or they? What so I see. There's a camera there.
Yeah, that's the
Right.
phone there.
Oh, okay. Right. Okay. Yeah. No, it's useful to know where the audience is because I mean, there's 10 people in here and there's probably like thousands on there. So. It's,
I appreciate your optimism on that. That's very nice of you. The teeming masses.
yeah. Yeah.
Peaked at 6. Nice.
Wow. 6,000.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nice.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, so it's really nice to talk to everybody here. I know a lot of people. I don't know everybody yet, but I think, looking forward to getting to know those who I don't know. So I'm Richard. I teach composition at the University of Manchester. This is kind of based a little bit on a presentation I did last year in Salzburg, Microtone, Small is Beautiful. But this one will be better because then we had to write about it, and then you actually think, oh, okay, that's what I wanted to say. So you'll have to bear with me because there's going to be a few tangents that go away from microtones, so I hope people can withstand that. But I think maybe just some of the, I guess you probably know me, if you know me, you probably know me through Lud's Church, which is the piece that I wrote for Stephen Altoft, which he played here last year. And so just to know, I have done other microtonal works. I've been interested in it for ages, and I think my interest probably comes from being a pianist and just like interested in all the things that pianos don't do very easily. Just like in my music, I'm also very interested in sort of timbral shifts, and that's kind of hard on the piano. But I mean, I love the piano, but there's so many other things in life as well. So these are a few selected works where, and if you like, I think one of the defining features is kind of like a sliding spectrum between like normal sounds and dirty sounds and white noise sounds, and just from spectrum from pitch to noise, if you like, and also interest in other pitches. But of course, when you start putting noise into it and you get imprecisions, then and it's come up a bit today, about the accuracy of things. But anyway, various approaches. I mean, I've done these are not the only pieces, but I suppose I should mention that. Tomorrow, I believe you're going to hear the first modern reincarnation of Vortex with Laura and Stephen playing together. And on the 30th of June, which is scarily close to where we are now, there's the second incarnation of Vortex, which is, I've written a trio for lumitone, 19-tone flugelhorn, and soprano. So I've got the soprano, Sarah, she's great. She's going to, I recorded everything for her so she could listen, and she, even when we read through it, she did a surprisingly good job. So, it is possible, I think, to sing in microtones. So, anyway, onwards. So this is where I start deviating away from microtones a bit. So, because a lot of my music is concerned with nature, I get a lot of inspiration from nature, phenomenon in nature, how do you represent it as a place to think, but also just if you think about, I go into nature and I'm sort of looking really closely at things, and with music, we often listen very closely. I mean, if we're interested in microtones, we're interested in these sort of close details within the sound. So it seems like a very organic thing to do here. This is a flower, a rose, a wild rose on the Ashton Canal, which was photographed. Well, I took lots of photographs when I was planning this piece. I'm going to go through all that in a minute, but this is part of the inspiration of the piece. You think about the textures in nature and the details and the patterns, but you also think about when you experience nature and shifting weather, shifting seasons, so short-term variations. It's always changing, it's always different, but it's always recognizable. But then we live in a moment of time, and global warming, is threatening everything. But then you go back further, there's the evolution of plants and tectonic plates. It's all this stuff. It's a fascinating source of musical ideas for me. And I suppose that looking closely, so, you can see the connection with microtones. So just introducing this piece I'm going to talk about. So I wrote it in 2023, Unwanted Wildness, because it's about plants that are growing in the wild. There's a picture of this is from the first performance. It was performed by Marc Danel and Gilles Millet from the Quatuor Danel, and who we're very lucky in Manchester. They come to visit us a few times each year, and they're just incredible performers. So I'll play you a few excerpts for this as we go on, but it's in the listening room. Is that what it's called? The listening session tonight, so you can listen to the whole score. So I guess I'm lucky because I can sort of show you a few things beforehand. I've put here a link to the, it's on YouTube, and there's also the score. Talking of scores, I made a few copies which I can pass around. Sorry, can I just...
Please.
If anybody wants to browse through the score as I'm talking, and who knows, the score may even be more interesting than the talk. I think it's not around right than the other way around, to be honest. But, so, I've got 3. I made them specially yesterday, so if anybody that don't, these are not really for distribution because you have to pay money from composers ensemble to get them. So, pass them around. So, I guess whilst we're talking about, just to get some of the notation things, because it's come up. So the notation I use in this, the notation, I guess I use a spectrum of, it's not systematic. I'm not thinking about different divisions of the octave, but you do have to think about pragmatics of things. And so I use semitones, third tones, quarter tones, sixth tones. Some of the thinking of that is like what's the logistics of what's possible on the violin. So on the violin, the fingers are a certain width. So you can get the finest distinctions of tones. When you do a vibrato, you get a tiny sort of variation in the tone just by rolling the finger, but it's quite hard to control that in a performance situation. And so I'm a very bad viola player. When I was playing on the viola, and I figured that probably the narrowest interval that it's realistic to do sort of normal fingering, where you use adjacent fingers for adjacent notes, is probably about a third tone, if you squeeze the fingers together. So anything quarter tone, sixth tone, you can't do normal fingering. It's more sort of sliding existing fingers. And of course, the navigation, it tends to be adjustments of familiar pitches because that's just the way people are. But I wanted the idea that, when you're in nature, there's like no limits. I want it to feel like there's no limits. And sixth tones and third tones, there's quite a different quality, I feel, from half tones, quarter tones. And so it just gives a bit more spectrum. So the notation-wise, if there's an arrow on an accidental, it adjusts it by a sixth tone. I also use the standard quarter tonal notation. Now, strictly speaking, I guess you could put an arrow on those notes and then you could get 12. But I didn't go into that much detail because it's all very well notating all that stuff, but is anybody going to play it accurately? Which, of course, playing this accurately is phenomenally difficult. But you see, it had sort of interest in the texture because, so the narrowest intervals is actually going from a unison, going across the two strings. If you want to do very close beating, that's the way you do it. So that's kind of a starting point for the very smallest intervals, going across the strings and sliding the fingers. So you can see the way it works at the beginning on the tiniest intervals, like the microest sort of pitch range and also internal pitches that you can have.
And just the other notation thing, I did the boxes are sort of tremolos across strings. And I did that just because I just find the traditional notation for tremolos across strings really cumbersome. And when you've got, it's okay with relatively simple rhythms like that. But when the rhythms, if you're doing it sort of over ties and within tuplets, it's just a complete nightmare. So it just means, you know, accelerate across the two strings. Hopefully it's an intuitive enough form of notation. Okay, so now I move back onto nature and plants and everything. Weeds and wildflowers. So I suppose some of the inspiration came from, this book was recommended to me by a colleague in Manchester, somebody called Anke Bernal, who is not a music lecturer, she's like ancient history or something, but she does all this stuff about people writing about, particularly moss, but you know, other plants, and you know, she's got so much knowledge about it. So this book was recommended to me, and I was reading this book, and it's talking about the complex relationships of what happens in nature. So we're talking about moss. I mean, I love moss, and the second incarnation of Vortex. If anybody wants to hear that, they will hear Steve on his flugelhorn representing the reproductive cycle of mosses, which goes over 2 generations, and it's very complicated through the textures on the flugelhorn. Moss, it's like one of the earliest plants, like when life, you know, it started in water on Earth. I don't know about other planets, but on Earth. And then it started to sort of grow next to water. It's reliant on water, but it doesn't grow in water. It grows kind of adjacent to water. So there's some of the oldest plants on the planet are mosses, and it's found just about everywhere. And it's not just found in, you know, next to waterfalls and in damp woodlands and everything. It's found in deserts. It's found in the Arctic, because it's incredibly resilient. And in a way, because it's so simple, it's got that resilience about it. And it's a beautiful plant. And once you start taking an interest and you see it, you sort of find it everywhere. And it's kind of weird when you think there's a sort of multi-million-pound industry in removing moss from lawns. So you have a nice green carpet plant that grows naturally on the ground, and people want to have a nice green carpet-like surface in their gardens, and they pay all this stuff to poison the biodiverse option that grows there naturally in order to have a fake thing, which is just sort of uniform grass. It always seems a bit sort of weird to me, but it's an example of our complex relationship with nature. You know, we love flowers. I know Mother's Day was quite recently, and people buy flowers. We buy cut flowers, kind of like flowers that have been killed to sort of give to people, but you know, but they're beautiful, and you know, okay, who doesn't like flowers? They are beautiful. We really appreciate flowers, but a lot of flowers sort of don't quite grow where we want them, and there's a lot of flowers that, okay, they're not the sort of big, beautiful things that attract attention, but they're fascinating and they're resilient. So, yeah, I've got here, I mean, as an example of brambles. I mean, anyone who has a garden, they've probably got a battle going on with brambles. They're amazing. They just grow everywhere. Whenever I pull them, I do actually pull them out of the garden, but I do admire them when I do that. And also, you know, they give you these wonderful blackberries to eat in August, which are wonderful. So they grow everywhere, and if you're pulling them out, then you don't get the blackberry harvest. But it's wonderful food for the birds. It's really important. But so maybe says weeds are not only plants in the wrong place, but plants which may have been shipped into the wrong culture. We have here at the bottom picture, I don't know if you recognize this plant, Himalayan balsam. That's very notoriously a plant that's considered exotic in probably the 19th century, sort of came here in boats, and it invades our riverbanks. This is in Manchester, the River Mersey. It's got these nice purple flowers, but it grows everywhere, and it grows so dense that it squeezes out all the native plant life, and so it's a real problem. And sometimes you see people have tried to remove them, but you just remove it and they grow back. And if you if you squeeze the seed heads, they're amazing. You can see why they do this, because you squeeze, and all these seeds kind of explode out into a shower of it. So you think, oh my God, this is just impossible. How can you remove this stuff? It's incredible. I'm in awe of it, but it's a bloody nuisance. So it's interesting. And so I guess thinking about all these reflections and thinking about biodiversity and plants in the wrong places and everything, I was thinking naturally of, in Manchester, the canals. Because the canal, this is a map of Manchester, not the best map of Manchester. But I thought of the canals because it was kind of during the pandemic. I was like just going on bike rides, exploring the city a bit more than I had on the bike, because it's just a really nice thing to do. And I discovered many of the canals. They're not that close to where I live, but I got to know this stretch here on the Ashton Canal quite well, because it's not so far. And they're like these corridors of nature. But they're also corridors, well, some of it's neglected, just falling apart mills, but some of it is being rejuvenated. And you see there's the Etihad Stadium here, and there's a whole new stadium they're building next to it, and it's all new. But then, and here there's all these gleaming sort of new fancy buildings with shiny materials and interesting sort of modernist sort of aesthetic. And then here it's a bit sort of crumbling and things. And then here it's kind of housing estates, and then it's sort of industry. But through whatever's growing, it's a sort of green corridor. And I was thinking, I wonder what grows here. There must be all sorts of interesting things growing here. And so I came up with the idea for this piece. I knew I was going to write a violin duo. And I know that violins are really good at doing different sounds, and also different gradations of pitch. So that's all kind of like up the street of what I'm interested in. So I just thought, I wonder what grows here. So what I did, I'll show you. This is here's a few pictures of that I took. So between March and June 2023, when I was writing it, or before I was writing it, when I was just sort of researching, doing the I rode my bike along this towpath many times, and I stopped in various places and I took photos of what was growing. And at first, of course, you have these tiny little green things, and I don't know what it's going to grow into, but you can see, new life coming up everywhere. And as time goes by, some things you recognise, daffodils, bluebells, rose, wild rose. Some things, you see them everywhere. Like this. I think it's Herb Robert or something. I can't remember. It might be something else. I can't remember now. But and it's not the kind of thing you have in your garden, but it's cool, and it's resilient. And every year it grows there, and it does, and it has flowers, and it pollinates, and you look at it, and it's complex. So, basically, I was just looking at what's growing and taking a record, and I used a plant identification app. And that's too much information for you. But basically, I identified over 60 species of things. I don't know if the identification's 100% accurate. In a way, it doesn't really matter. It's just the diversity. And I'm sure that's just skating on the surface, and a botanist would see all the different sort of variations on the same things, and they'd probably see a lot more than me. And of course, I'm biased by what I'm riding by and thinking, that looks interesting. I'll have a closer look at that. But anyway, huge number of plants were growing, and I thought this was fascinating. Of course, what do you do with that information? How do you make a composition out of it? So that's one of the puzzles, how to do that. The other puzzle, I guess, just going back to, this is a more accurate map of where I was, but it's a bit harder to read. But this is, that's a literal map. So often when I write a piece, I try to get a portrait of the place, something about it. And you won't hear this in the piece, but the proportions of the piece are going along this stretch of canal in the direction I tended to ride my bike. And whenever there's a lock, that's in red numbers, and whenever there's a bridge going over it, those are blue numbers. And so you get a kind of proportion from there, and then that's a shape. And it's an interesting challenge. How can I make that shape work musically? Because you have to have, it doesn't have to be precise by the second, but let's just try and make this shape. It will give me something that's inspired by the place. So this is something I tend to do. And then the other puzzle, and then apologies, this one looks even more daunting, but that's a sketch. But you can see the process. You can see vertically those proportions, yeah? And then notes going along where I'm sort of thinking of a texture. So there's various textures that, so when there's a bridge when there's a bridge, the texture changes. And when there's a lock, not quite always, but sometimes when there's a lock, there's a more significant change. So I came up with this structure where there's these longer sections with various textures, and then these sort of differentiated sections in purple called B flat to E rising. And so the B flat to E rising bits are representing growth itself, so less sort of textural, timbral diversity, just harmony, sort of just going up in microtones. Whereas the other bits, there's representing the plants. And the plants, well, if you don't tend to see plants alone, you see them as part of ecosystems. So there's basically textures where it's inspired by there's a certain collection of plants. So let's try and get something that represents that diversity, not being precise, but just thinking about it as an overall impression. And then through the piece, it's kind of going along the canal geographically, but it's also going through the seasons. So we start off in March when everything's tiny, and we end up in June when everything is in full flower and big and dense, full of interest. So that's the principle behind the structure. And the bit on the right is just kind of going into more detail on the bit on the left. But rather than go into this, I'll just show you, this is a sort of summary of what you've just seen in a more sort of done after the piece. This isn't a sketch, this is an analysis of it. So you can see the shape I just described, and the point is that the different textures, they have different pitch elements, microtones, as part of the expression, not used in a systematically way, used in an intuitive way, just as part of the vocabulary. So there's a shape that is through the piece that's articulated partly through dynamics, and those dynamics are oversimplification, but it shows the big things. Partly through range, which starts, as you saw, very, very narrow, just on the E5, and then expands slightly. So the range is very, very narrow at the start and wider at the end of the piece. And for a while I was thinking, could I write a whole piece within a perfect fifth? And then I rejected that idea because I wanted to have the sense of growth. And I should reference, there's a piece by Pedro Finisterra, which he showed on one of the microtonal zooms that some of us have had. And I mean, we should just make sure everybody who wants to be involved in microtonal zoom, has access to it, I guess. But I remember Pedro talked about a string quartet he'd written that was, that I thought had many parallels with this. So if Pedro's watching, this was written before I'd seen his piece, but I just thought, I saw his piece and I thought, there's some resonances in here. So, yeah, okay. You see range, dynamic, and different combinations of microtones happening. So maybe if I just show you now a few excerpts from the piece. How long have I got? I don't have that long, do I?
Well, please go ahead.
No. All right, well, I'll just play you the very beginning, which sounds, I've described the beginning already, so this is what it sounds like. I should say that you might notice when you see the score, it's not always 100% precise because they didn't have a huge amount of rehearsal time, but they are the most amazing musicians, and there's a sort of real understanding, I think a really deep understanding in the way they play it. So I really enjoyed this performance. Okay. That's coming through my computer. It's not coming through the sound system.
It might be a jack cable right next to the HDMI. See if that works. Huh?
Jack, I don't. There's that, but that's.
Oh, no, there isn't.
No.
Oh, terribly sorry about that.
No, don't worry.
Let's see if I
If not, we might be stuck with the computer audio.
Well, I mean, you'll hear it properly tonight, won't you?
Yes.
Shall I
Yeah,
just-
we can.
All right, look, let me just turn it. I'll turn the volume up on here for now, and then you hear it properly later. So yeah, oh, we're on a different page. So this is the very beginning. Okay, so we need to leave time for questions, so I'll just make the extracts a bit shorter. But that gives you a taste. I mean, almost nothing's happening there because it's tiny, but there's an energy, and you hear the beating, and you hear the details in there. So this is maybe a little bit further on. So you see that initial texture has shifted down a little bit. It's just kind of moved. And we have a melody in the second violin in third tones, because then you can finger it normally. And it doesn't, you wouldn't notice it's in third tones necessarily if you just heard it. But and you see there's a range of different articulations, different colours. They're like different plants, but they're sort of like little snappy things because they're just tiny little details. So let's just, a little sample of this. Maybe just move on a bit. All right, so that's a little flavour of something a little bit later. Oh, and then, right, here is a little flavour of, this is the first B flat to E rising. And you see B flat and E, very prominent notes. I guess that just comes from my sort of legacy, learning classical music, this sort of sense of structure and certain pitches being important. It's inside me. So here, I really enjoyed this. It's like a chorale, but it moves up in sixth tones. And then towards the end, it moves up in quarter tones. And later on, when this idea comes, you have bigger intervals as well. So let's, a little taste of this. Okay. I mean, the funny thing is that, because it's in a narrow range, but you hear the whole spectrum of the sound, so you hear a richness of sound, so it doesn't sound like it's in a narrow range because it's just so rich, and that's, But anyway, there is a sort of, this is the widest point in register so far because it's been going for about 5 minutes in quite narrow registers, so that top C and the bottom C sharp, I don't think we've had those sorts of notes before, so it's an event. I always liked, when I was young, learning the piano, the variations in the middle of the Appassionata by Beethoven, and it starts low and low and low, and then after about variation 3 is an octave higher, and then the last variation it's like faster and it's higher, and it's just, I just thought that was amazing, and so maybe there's a bit of that inspiration in here. Then this is really wide, isn't it? And that's semitones, very traditional. But maybe it sounds like a bit of an event after what's happened. And, well, so when you hear it just as a... Sorry. So that's a really... Oh, right. Sorry. What I wanted to say was... So it's a melody because flowers are like melodies, in a way. And, melodies are beautiful in a traditional way. But it's also I use a lot of wedge shapes because wedges sort of always think of, I think of growth moving outwards, and it's a way of doing that. And what you heard a slight snippet of the sort of middle B flat to E bit just before. Right. So then we have something that's this is dense, but you see it's in different tunings. So what have we got? Third tones, semitones, so wider intervals, but still mixed. And when you mix in tuning systems, as we know, we get sort of composite things which are more complex than they look. So just some biodiversity here. Right, sorry. I'm just very aware of time going, and I should leave some time for questions. So maybe I just leave the end. I'll just show you the end. I won't play it to you because you can hear it, but at least you know what you're aiming for. We have a B flat to E, so here we've got 3/4 tones in the first violin, and then 2/3 tones in the second violin later. So I always find those sorts of intervals, they're really fascinating because they just sound a bit alien. They don't sound like microtones because they're not small, but they're just different intervals. And that's the thing about microtones, isn't it? You have these different intervals, and intervals are colour. So anyway, and you can see there's, because things get overgrown and they interfere, so although it's B flat to E, there's still plants kind of interfering with it, those pesky brambles kind of just growing up. So yeah, and then we got the very end where it just, that's the very end. So widest range. Maybe it's pollen just kind of seeding itself into the air or whatever. So yeah, I think that's more or less everything. I don't think I'm very systematic. I know there's people that are sort of more theoretical, more systematic about it. It's kind of coming from intuitions, and it's also, it's complicated in all the parameters as well. But I suppose the B flat to E bits, they're trying to focus on the harmony more, so it's less complex in the other parameters at that point. So let's leave it there now, and thank you for having me. And any questions? Yeah, hi.
Yeah, I'm curious how you did organise the microtonal content. I like the gestures and the texture of the music. I can see the relationship with the plants and all the parts.
Yeah.
But yeah, how did the microtones come into that?
It's just part of the vocabulary. I suppose the way I talked about it, that's because that was, my thinking was sort of in from the sort of vision and the structure of it and the way of thinking I described. And then the microtones, I'm just using it because they're there. But I'm trying to think, right, I can have 6 tones. And I'm trying to be a little bit systematic in some of the plans. You see, so that I restrict it to certain divisions and the sort of certain widening. So, yeah, it's quite intuitive, really.
Is it like a bigger plant, you get bigger intervals?
Yes, you get bigger intervals as the piece goes on, and you're introduced to the wider intervals. First of all, yeah, exactly. It's analogous to that. Yeah. Does that answer?
Yeah.
The idea is it's like when you hear 12 semitones, you recognise the intervals. And the idea is you're supposed to be able to listen to it, and you don't recognise the intervals. There's something beyond your standard comprehension, but it still has a kind of sense to it. And you get all these wonderful colours in the process. That's sort of the thinking. Yeah, Steve.
I was just looking at the last page and wondering what in the first violin part where it says MST and MSP, what that means.
Molto sul pont, so very close to the bridge. Okay. Molto sul tasto, so sort of exaggeratedly on the fingerboard. Yeah, so you get the sort of timbral shifts and spectral shifts as well.
Interested because your approach to the composition is really interesting, and I'm wondering whether, if you're willing to share this, whether your initial explorations, whether you have any kind of like form where you do some kind of sketches, where you just come up with ideas, or do you just go straight into what becomes the final piece?
I go through many, many layers. It's like an onion, and some of the layers are more stressful than others. I mean, I love I love riding my bike along the thing and taking pictures and just enjoying the canals. That was great, and it's important to, it's important to have something enjoyable because it's easier to feel inspired by that. I always need to have some idea of the structure. So I showed you some of the structural planning because we saw your structural planning, which was really, if you've got scaffolding, you kind of know where to aim for. So there's a lot of structural planning before you're sort of getting onto the detailed level and working out actually what the details are. I need to sort of have some kind of shape that makes sense. And people think about, I don't know, the sort of architecture, gardening sort of thing about how top-down, bottom-up composers. And I guess I'm a mixed, you'd think I should be gardener with this interest, but I mean, I'm actually quite architectural in the way the music was written, but it's kind of both, really. Yeah, Paul.
Can I ask a question which is about instrumental technique? It's interesting that
Yeah.
you are a former viola. So you
Former, I like that.
so you understand the instrument. I got interested by the fact that early on, one of the violins has something that's almost an E triple stop, string 1,
Yeah.
2, and 3.
Yeah.
And that brings, if you go for that, that brings, that brings
It's not
a
on there, is it?
technical
Yeah.
issue. So it's easier to play a triple stop like that close to the bridge, almost impossible to play it soltasto because some of your strings are very close to the fingerboard.
Yeah.
So, anyway, it's perhaps it's a bit of a nerdy
No.
point to raise, but it just made me interested
Oh, hang on.
about the
Let's.
underlying physicality of the instrument. And
Yeah.
how much that shapes the ideas that one can compose.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I realised I was searching for it on here, but I guess it's in the score. But yeah, but not on any of these extracts. Well, I mean, it's going across the 3 strings with the E, with one note on the A string and one on the D string. If I ask for it to be soltasto, that may possibly be a mistake.
No, you hadn't.
Oh, I hadn't. Oh, that's
No,
a
you
relief.
hadn't. So I'm not picking you up on anything. I'm just interested the way that the physicality of the instrument shapes and determines what you can write. And
Yeah. Well, I mean, I worked out this texture. I wouldn't have been able to work out this texture if I wasn't able to just play, because it was sort of thinking, okay, how far can I push these things? And obviously, if you've got good players, you can push it further than somebody with an amateur technique. So going across 3 strings just seemed like a sort of. Well, I wanted to get away from E at some point, and sort of, the E is a bit of a pedal note, and then it needs to move. And so then if you have it on the A and D strings on pitches that are nearby, then you have a sense of movement. But you can have that with E at the same time, so why not do that at some point? Okay.
That was great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks for being such a nice audience. Thank you. I should collect the scores. I mean, you can give them. You can give me them back later if you want, like by tomorrow if you want. But all right.
Thank you again. That's great.
Thank you.
Just a quick note to everybody here and to everybody watching at home. We're going to take a break now. There is a listening session in this room, which is the Professor Stewart Hall, LG01. There's a listening session tonight from 7 p.m. until 9 p.m. Again, we're going to pop up the donation link just for a little while longer. So if anybody's interested in sending any amount of money, will be very helpful. Yeah, we will see you this evening. Again, thank you all to all of the presenters here, all of the organizers. This is a lot of fun to put together. So, thanks. Cool.